Hi everyone, welcome back to History 110. I hope your fall break was fantastic and relaxing and you went and did some fun things over your break. Today we're going to jump in with Unit 5, which is going over America's economic and industrial revolution of the 1800s. This is going to start to separate the North from the South in what type of economics and political atmospheres are going on. We also see a lot of increase in the economics of the western parts of the states and just how we communicate with them and what increases the move westward. So let's go ahead and get started with today's lesson. So the American Industrial Revolution has 5 factors as to what prompts it to kind of increase at a rapid speed. The first is the population. Second, transportation and the technologies and that increase and the new ways of transporting goods and people westward. Communication, the increase of communication and the ease of how we communicate with others becomes a unifying factor for America during these years. Technology, specifically in the industrial sector, skyrockets during this time, and it also just creates a feeling of innovation and imagination, and anyone could become an inventor during this time. And then business organization and how society runs these businesses and everything begins to change as well. So we're going to look at each of these 5 individual factors and how exactly they influence this industrial revolution. So first we look at the population. So it's basically a loop of supply and demand. The population had to be big enough to grow food and to supply the workforce, and then because there is more food and more jobs, families are having more children, and so it just continues on and on. And then this growth was also due to better public health and higher birth rates. So the American population, it increases significantly from 1830 to 1860, but then we also see that increase from 1821 to 1840 in immigration. So we have new people moving in from other nations and other countries because of the food supply and the job force stability. And then as they are also having families, Americans are having families as well. So some of the innovation that comes from transportation, it all basically pretty much comes down to water. So steamboats become one of the more popular ways to maneuver goods and people along our water systems. They were used like the Mississippi and the Ohio. And then we also have the Erie Canal is built. So this opens up the waterways in the very northern parts of the United States. New York, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Delaware, Maine, they have a new way to get their goods to the Atlantic and to the eastern coast. And so this was opened in 1825. It was the greatest construction project for the U.S. at the time. It was the largest and most innovative and most don't want to really say like empowering, but it was an example. It became a great constructional example for the U.S. and other nations. It was 350 miles long, and it obviously is still in use today. So these early railroads, there's a lot of innovation that comes for the railroad system that increases how goods are transported from the west to the east and vice versa, and how this makes commerce between these sections easier. So this obviously is because they're helping move the commerce across this new geographical area in the U.S. California to New York is not as difficult of a job to get goods from those two very separate states. And this is due to some technological breakthroughs. The first is the innovation of the tracks. It was before different railroad systems could use different tracks. They would be different sizes, and so the trains would have to have a different size wheel or different size wheelbase. And if your train didn't have the right size wheel and wheelbase, you could not use certain tracks, and you could not use certain railroad pathways. So a universal track system is created, and this makes it easier for more trains to go in totally different directions. Again, with our water power, the creation of the steamed power locomotive is a lot easier to run, and at every major railway station and stop, there's going to be water for the people that are living in those towns and in those places, and so you know that there's going to be water to refill your locomotive with as well. And then we have the development of passenger cars and freight. So this opens up a new commerce of being able to sell tickets for passengers on the cars. And then the freight cars, instead of it being kind of this type of car is for barley and this type of car is for cows or wood or whatever, these freight cars open up a universal usage, and so it's a lot easier to maneuver goods, and it can change easier as well. So this map right here is important for our unit now, but it's also going to be important for our next two units as well. So you can see in 1850 what the railroad system looked like, and then just 10 years later how it increases. But there's a few things that I want to point out. First is how much it increases in the north versus how little it increases in the south. Yes, there are a few rail lines that are increased. There are a few that travel farther up to the north than they had in the past, but there's still not a lot of railway systems throughout the south. But the north is heavily innovated with railroad growth. So this is a couple of things. One, it shows just how industrialized the north is versus how industrialized the south is, and how agricultural they still are in their economics. And then it also points out how open the north is to these innovations and increasing the presence of railways, whereas the south is wanting to kind of protect what society they have and the types of innovations and the types of industries that they already have, and wanting to protect farmland more in the south. So this is going to come back up in our unit 6 and 7 when we talk about some other things. So you may want to maybe like screen capture this map, save it with your notes so you can go back and forth and have it as a reference. So the breakthroughs in communication. The first, 1844, the telegraph is invented. Samuel Morse, the first telegraph ever sent, he transmits the news of Polk winning the presidency from D.C. to Baltimore, Maryland. By 1860, so less than 20 years later, there is 50,000 miles of telegraph wire throughout the United States. During this time, we also see an increase in journalism. One of those being from the creation of the cylinder rotary press in 1846. This made it quicker and cheaper to print newspapers, and with the quickness of the telegram, breaking news alerts could be sent from different towns to other states and other towns via telegram, and then it can be in an hour or two printed out on a newspaper and ready to sell to the citizens of that town, instead of having to wait a day or 2 days for the news to get there and then the newspaper being printed out. So that really increased the availability of news via the newspapers. And then also in the 1840s, the Associated Press is created. And basically what the Associated Press is, and still is to this day, is it's journalists who are part of a cooperative group that gather news from different states and different towns, and then they pass it along at this time, passed it along via telegram, and then those news stories were being printed in other newspapers throughout the nation. So it was easy for someone who lives in New York to get the news of what is happening in New Orleans or Houston. And it's easy for a mother who is living in Florida to know what is happening in Massachusetts, where her daughter lives, and things like that. So it really promotes this cooperative learning and this cooperative news gathering. And journalism, and specifically through the Associated Press, becomes the unifying factor of American life in the 1840s and 50s. You're not just concerned about with what's going on in your town or the town over. You can be concerned and be in the know of the news throughout the entire nation. So some of the technological advancements. The most important contribution to manufacturing was machine tools. So things that don't have to be ran, or things that don't have to be done by human hand. They can be done by machine and ran by an operator. Really changes the manufacturing scale, and it changes it on a very large scale. So you're being able to mass produce a lot of products in the U.S. now. And the government would support a lot of this research and the development of machine tools for their military, because with this, the military connection with machine tools is the turret lathe and the universal milling machines are created. So this not only has an impact on the commercial industrial side of the U.S., it also helps with the military industrial side. Another important technological advancement is interchangeable parts, because now, instead of when a machine breaks down, you have to build a whole new machine and you have to wait for that machine to be built, you can replace whatever part broke on a machine and it's back up and running a lot quicker than waiting for a brand new machine to come in. So this really streamlined the factories without having to take as long of breaks in production because of broken machines. And then the technological innovations of this time skyrocket. Anyone can come up with a new idea and patent it and then manufacture it. So comparing some patent records, in 1830, the patent records, there were 544 that had been recorded with the government. 20 years later, in 1850, it was 993, which is a pretty big jump. However, 10 years later, in 1860, the number was 4,778. Anyone could be an inventor at this time. Anyone could patent this new innovative machine or idea that they have. And this really encourages technology to boom. And because of that, business organizations have to change a little bit. Most of your factories are going to be ran by daring, imaginative, ruthless entrepreneurs whose wealth that has came from their family and from generations past allows them to have a conspicuous consumption, so they can buy whatever they want whenever they want. They can buy however much they want. And because of that, they can also put a lot of money into making factories. So the emergence of factories becomes very important. Most of the manufacturing before 1812 took place in private homes or in small workshops. The supply and demand was based on just what you could sell in your town and the surrounding towns. But now with factories, you're wanting to produce to be able to ship to states as far west as California. And so factories become, the workforce for factories and the manufacturing of products becomes very significant during this time. And this begins with the New England textile industry. These newer, larger machines, they're driven by water power, and it brought all components under one roof. You didn't have to go to one person to get your yarn changed from wool into yarn, and then you didn't have to take that yarn to a weaver to make a piece of cloth, and then you didn't have to take that piece of cloth to a seamstress to be sewn together. It was all together under one roof, and it made for faster and more efficient manufacturing. The total value of manufactured goods during this time, in the 1840s, it was about $483 million, which was pretty good. It would increase in 10 years to $1 billion, and then would increase to $2 billion in 1860, which doesn't seem like a lot, but that is a very incredible increase for 20 years. And it's important to note, going back to our map from just a few minutes ago, that the majority of these goods were being manufactured and sold in the north. They're not shipping a lot of things to the south. They're shipping a lot of things westward or keeping them in the northern states. But a lot of this innovation, a lot of this money from manufactured goods is not going into the south. And this is one of the things that's going to start to separate even further the economics of these states. So these are a couple of photos from some of the early factories in New England. As you can see, it's mostly children and women, and even the children, it's mostly little girls who are working. Your article analysis is going to be looking at the Lowell factory and the working conditions of these factories. They were not moral or ethical in any way, and so a union is created, and that's kind of what is going to be looked over in your article analysis, so I won't give away too much. But in New England, a lot of immigrant deaths will come from these factories. There's also a lot of single mothers that come out of these factories. They go into the factories with no children, and then they come out with several children, and if they are not married, they are single parents because the fathers, who are the foremen of the factories, will not take responsibility, mainly because they have families, they have wives, and what if their wives knew what actually had happened. I think you're kind of getting where I'm going with this. So a lot of unethical, unmoral things happen in these factories very early on. So there is a pattern to the industrial society. The first is that it's rich versus poor. So the owners of these factories are the top 5%. In 1845, 4% of Boston owned 65% of the wealth in Boston. And by 1860, of the entire American population, only 5% of families possessed more than 50% of the nation's wealth. So slaves, natives, landless farmers, and unskilled workers, they had no economic growth during the early 1800s. Now, for these individuals, you could see an increase in their workability because even unskilled workers, you can get a job in a factory and run a machine, push a button, or take products off of a line and move it somewhere else. So there was economic and job stability, but there was no growth. The social mobility, though, of the industrial society is pretty fluid. It was easy for a working man to climb the economic ladder. It was also easier for geographical mobility. It was very easy to be an innovator and come up with a new invention and set out west and find land, build a building, and start manufacturing this product and selling it and becoming a businessman and becoming a manufacturer. So social mobility was pretty easy to climb the ladder if you were able to have those ideas. And then the middle class life really becomes prominent in between rich, underclass, and the middle class. We start to see that distinction because you didn't have to own land, you just had to be able to provide a service. So it didn't matter if you know, a lot of families, especially out west, if they moved out and they hadn't been part of the western settlement to where they had farmland, they could move into a town and rent a building or build a building that they have on rented land and live in the top of the building and run a store or a bar or a hotel or a restaurant or whatever in the bottom of the house. And so again, you really didn't have to own land, you just had to be able to provide a service. And here's a couple of photos from the time of what this industrialization looks like. So our main industrial cities, they're starting to increase. We're starting to see, you know, the rail lines running through, the streetcars, big actual stores being able to mass produce goods. But then on the outskirts of those towns, you still have, with that picture on the left, you still have these very poor towns, and the workers of these factories and of these places, where they live doesn't match up to what they are helping produce. So that is all of the lecture I have for you for this unit. You have a video that you're going to watch that's going to go over a little bit more of the textile industry and how it grows and what those factories looked like for this time period, and then also you'll learn some more about that as well in your article analysis. So again, I hope you had a great break. I hope this eases you right back into History 110, and let's finish out these last 8 weeks pretty strong.